In the quiet, tree-lined neighborhood of Brookside Estates, everything looked peaceful from the outside. Manicured lawns stretched down the cul-de-sac. Driveways gleamed with polished SUVs, and the Homeowners Association prided itself on order and control. But behind that shiny facade lay tension, a pressure that had been building for years, waiting for the right spark to ignite it. That spark came in the form of a man named David. He wasn't loud or disruptive. He didn't throw parties or clutter his yard with junk. In fact, he was one of the most respectful residents in Brookside. But David valued independence, and independence was something the HOA, led by its iron-fisted president, Karen Mitchell, despised. David had inherited his property from his late father, a modest yet well-kept home on one of the oldest lots in the community. Unlike many of the cookie-cutter houses, his stood out with character: an old oak tree shading the driveway, a handmade wooden fence, and a backyard garden that had been nurtured for decades. To David, this property wasn't just real estate, it was family history, a legacy. Karen, however, saw it differently. She saw the fence as non-compliant, the tree as a hazard, and the garden as unsightly. To her, David's home wasn't a legacy, it was a blemish on the uniform. Perfection she demanded, and when he resisted her endless notices and fines, Karen and the HOA board decided to escalate. At first, the fines seemed manageable: $50 for the fence, $100 for the tree trimming, $75 for landscaping inconsistencies. David paid some but refused others, pointing out how arbitrary and unfair they were. His refusals only enraged Karen further. Over the months, the fines snowballed. Late fees, administrative charges, and interest piled onto the amounts. What had started as a few $100s grew into thousands. David contested them, wrote letters, even attended board meetings, but his voice was drowned out by Karen and her loyalists. They had the rules on their side, or at least, that's what they claimed. Then, one morning, David received the letter that made his stomach drop. It was official notice that the HOA had moved to seize his property. They claimed he was delinquent in his dues and fines, and under the association's bylaws, they had the right to foreclose. The home his father had built, the land that carried his childhood memories, was being taken away, not by the bank, not by the government, but by his own neighbors. The news spread like wildfire through Brookside. Some residents were shocked, whispering in disbelief that the HOA would go that far. Others shrugged, too fearful of Karen's wrath to speak against her. A few even supported it, muttering that David should have just followed the rules. But beneath the surface, unease grew. If the HOA could seize his home, whose property might be next? On the day of the seizure, Karen arrived with her clipboard and a smug smile, accompanied by board members and an attorney. To her, this was a triumph, a demonstration of the HOA's power. David stood on his porch, powerless to stop the legal machinery set in motion against him. He watched as the paperwork was signed, his property transferred into the HOA's control, his fight seemingly over. But what Karen and the HOA didn't realize was that their greed had set something in motion, far larger than they expected. David wasn't finished. He quietly began gathering evidence, documenting every fine, every notice, every contradiction in the HOA's rulings. He spoke to neighbors who had also been targeted, building a file that painted a damning picture of abuse of power. And outside of Brookside Estates, people were beginning to pay attention. Word of the HOA seizing a longtime resident as property over petty fines started to trickle into local forums, then into the press. A story was forming, one that cast David not as a delinquent homeowner, but as a victim of corporate-style greed in his own neighborhood. The HOA believed they had silenced him by taking his home. In reality, they had awakened something far more dangerous, a fight for justice that would stretch far beyond the borders of Brookside. As Karen celebrated what she thought was her greatest victory, she had no idea she had just written the first line of her downfall. The home she had seized would become the symbol of everything wrong with her rule and the weapon that would ultimately destroy her. The battle was no longer about a fence or a garden. It was about power, greed, and the lengths to which ordinary people could be pushed before they pushed back. And David was ready to push back harder than anyone expected. The seizure of David's property sent a chill through Brookside Estates. On the surface, Karen declared it a victory. She spoke at the next board meeting with an air of triumph. Praising the efficiency of the HOA and reminding residents that rules were rules, she framed David as a cautionary tale, a man who thought he could defy the HOA and had paid the price. Some in the room nodded, too intimidated to show disapproval. Others sat silently, exchanging uneasy glances. The message was clear. Compliance wasn't optional. It was mandatory, enforced by fear, and backed by the threat of losing one's home. But beneath the silence, resentment was building. David's absence from his home was noticed immediately. The house stood dark at night, the garden untended, the oak tree casting lonely shadows over the driveway. For many neighbors, it wasn't just the loss of a property, it was the loss of a man who had been part of their community for years. Children had played in his yard, older residents had admired his garden, and he had been a quiet presence that made Brookside feel like home. Now that presence was gone, erased by the HOA's hunger for control. At first, whispers filled the neighborhood. Families spoke in hushed tones over dinner, questioning how fines for a fence or a tree could justify taking someone's entire property. In garages and kitchens, neighbors began comparing their own notices. A pattern emerged. Karen's board had been targeting certain residents again and again, piling fines for the smallest infractions, while ignoring others. The rules weren't about fairness, they were about control. One by one, stories surfaced. An elderly couple fined for having their grandson's bicycle in the driveway. A single mother threatened with foreclosure over unauthorized flower pots. A young family forced to pay hundreds for leaving holiday lights up a few days past the deadline. Each story added weight to the growing suspicion that what happened to David wasn't an isolated case, it was the result of greed and abuse of power. As neighbors shared their frustrations, something shifted. Fear, once the dominant force in Brookside, began to give way to anger. People realized that if the HOA could take David's home, none of them were safe. The question wasn't if it would happen again, but when. Meanwhile, David, though displaced, was not defeated. He quietly met with neighbors who reached out, collecting their testimonies, adding them to his growing archive of evidence. He recorded dates, documented inconsistencies, and built a case that painted a picture of an HOA driven not by community spirit, but by financial exploitation. His work was slow, methodical, and relentless. The turning point came when a local journalist received an anonymous tip about Brookside. The story was too shocking to ignore, and HOA seizing a man's home over fines that amounted to little more than petty harassment. The reporter began digging, speaking with residents, and soon uncovered a pattern of predatory practices. When the article was published, it spread like wildfire. The headline was damning: HOA seizes family home over fence and garden disputes. Readers across the city and eventually across the state were outraged. Online forums lit up with debates. Social media posts condemned the HOA, and people who had never set foot in Brookside Estates were suddenly invested in the fight. For Karen, it was a nightmare. The image she had cultivated as a strict but fair leader collapsed under public scrutiny. Neighbors who had once feared her now saw her exposed as a tyrant. At the next board meeting, the atmosphere was different. Instead of silence, Karen faced glares, crossed arms, and whispered conversations that stopped the moment she entered the room. Her attempt to brush off the media coverage only made things worse. She called the article fake news and dismissed residents' concerns as exaggerations. But her denials rang hollow. The more she tried to tighten her grip, the more people slipped through her fingers. A group of residents began organizing quietly, meeting outside official channels. They called themselves the Brookside Reform Committee, a collection of homeowners who wanted transparency, fairness, and accountability. For the first time, Karen faced not just whispers of dissent, but a coordinated effort to dismantle her control. David, though still without his property, became the rallying point. The Reform Committee looked to him for guidance, his evidence forming the backbone of their case. His fight had become their fight, and the home Karen had seized became the symbol of everything wrong with her rule. As the weeks passed, the pressure mounted. More reporters showed up at Brookside, filming the silent house that once belonged to David, interviewing angry residents, and demanding answers from Karen. Footage of her shouting at journalists, waving her clipboard, and storming away from cameras only cemented her image as the villain of the story. And yet, Karen refused to back down. Her pride blinded her to the reality around her. She insisted she was protecting property values, that she was acting in the best interest of the community, and that those who opposed her were troublemakers. But each excuse rang emptier than the last. The seeds of rebellion had been planted. What had started as whispers over dinner tables had grown into meetings, petitions, and plans. The residents of Brookside were no longer afraid. They were angry, and their anger was focused on the HOA president, who had crossed the line one time too many. Karen believed she had silenced David by seizing his property, but all she had done was awaken an entire community. And the more she tried to crush that resistance, the stronger it grew. The stage was set. The battle that began with one man's garden and fence was about to engulf the entire neighborhood. And Karen, blind to the storm forming around her, had no idea how close she was to losing everything. Karen was cornered, but a cornered tyrant often lashes out harder than ever. The press was hounding her, the community was whispering rebellion, and David's story was spreading far beyond Brookside Estates. To anyone else, these would have been signs to step back, to reconsider, to make peace. But not to Karen. To her, retreat meant weakness, and weakness was something she could never allow. So, she doubled down. The first step in her counterattack was paperwork. Within days of the articles exposing the HOA, new violation notices appeared across the neighborhood. Yards that had never been scrutinized were suddenly non-compliant. Mailboxes were deemed the wrong shade of beige. Garden beds were labeled unsanctioned landscaping projects, and cars parked half an inch over a driveway line were flagged for immediate towing. The message was clear: speak against the HOA, and you would be punished. Even those who had stayed silent began receiving letters. It was no longer about specific infractions. It was about reasserting control through fear. But instead of quelling dissent, Karen's tactics had the opposite effect. Families compared their letters, realizing the HOA was weaponizing the rules to keep them in line. Neighbors who had never spoken to each other before gathered to vent their frustration. What Karen thought was intimidation became fuel for unity. Still, she pushed further. At the next board meeting, she pushed through measures that gave her even more unchecked authority. Emergency powers. She called them special permissions that allowed her to issue fines and enforce penalties without waiting for board votes. Her loyalists nodded along, too scared to oppose her directly, though their faces betrayed unease. Karen wasn't just fighting to control Brookside anymore. She was fighting for her pride. The story of David's seized property had bruised her ego, and now she was determined to make an example out of anyone who challenged her. Meanwhile, David and the Brookside Reform Committee continued their quiet work. They documented everything: the new fines, the arbitrary rules, the intimidation. David's file of evidence was no longer just his story. It had become the story of the entire community. A growing archive of Karen's overreach, each violation notice, each photograph of a neighbor's yard, each frustrated testimony added weight to the case building against the HOA. Karen, however, wasn't worried about evidence. She believed the law was on her side. After all, the HOA had bylaws, contracts, and the power of foreclosure. What she didn't understand was that her very abuse of those tools was about to turn them against her. The breaking point came when she attempted to flex her foreclosure power again. This time, she targeted a retired couple who had lived in Brookside for decades. Their crime: a backyard shed that was deemed unapproved. The fines had piled up, and Karen moved swiftly to seize their property just as she had with David. But this time, the community erupted. Dozens of neighbors showed up on the couple's lawn, holding signs and demanding the HOA stop. Reporters arrived within hours, broadcasting the confrontation live. Footage showed Karen, red-faced and yelling, clutching her clipboard as residents shouted back. The image went viral, spreading across social media like wildfire. Karen thought she was demonstrating authority. Instead, she had exposed herself as the villain once again. And this time, there was no ambiguity. Viewers saw the cruelty of threatening an elderly couple with homelessness over a shed, and sympathy for the homeowners surged. Behind closed doors, the board began to fracture. Even Karen's most loyal supporters started to waver, afraid of being dragged down with her. Some whispered about resigning. Others quietly leaked information to reporters. Karen didn't notice. She was too focused on her next move, convinced she could still tighten her grip if she just pushed harder. In her mind, David was still the root of it all. Even without his property, she believed he was orchestrating the rebellion. She began spreading rumors, claiming he was a troublemaker, that he had fabricated evidence, that he was motivated by revenge rather than justice. But her words no longer carried the weight they once had. Residents, who had seen his calm determination, compared it to her outbursts and found her credibility unraveling. By now, David's story had reached legal advocates who specialized in HOA abuse. What began as one man's fight had become a cause larger than Brookside. Attorneys began reviewing his files, astonished at the scope of Karen's misconduct. They saw not just harassment, but patterns of financial mismanagement, possibly even fraud. The Reform Committee's evidence had teeth, and it was only a matter of time before those teeth bit back. Karen, however, kept escalating. She hired private security to patrol the neighborhood, claiming it was to protect community safety. In reality, the guards were instructed to monitor residents, take photos of supposed violations, and report anyone seen speaking with reporters. The streets of Brookside, once quiet and welcoming, began to feel like a surveillance zone. And yet, the more she tried to control, the less she truly controlled. Children whispered about spies, families mocked the endless notices, and even those who had once supported her began to distance themselves. The trust she had relied on for years was gone. All that remained was fear, and fear was slipping through her fingers. The Reform Committee grew. Bolder, they began printing flyers, sharing information door to door, and planning a petition to remove Karen from power. Meetings that had once been hidden were now public, with dozens attending. The community that Karen believed she could silence had found its voice, and that voice was growing louder by the day. Karen's pride blinded her to the storm forming around her. She believed she was still untouchable, that the bylaws gave her invincibility. But what she didn't realize was that every fine she issued, every property she targeted, and every confrontation she staged was digging her deeper into a hole she could not climb out of. The HOA had taken David's property in greed, but that greed had awakened something far stronger than Karen's authority, the will of a united community. And soon, the HOA's tactics would face not just the anger of residents, but the scrutiny of the law. The morning after the standoff on the elderly couple's lawn, Brookside Estates no longer looked like a quiet suburban community. The echoes of shouting still lingered in the air, and the sight of neighbors banding together against the HOA had planted a seed of defiance that could not be uprooted. But it was not just the residents who had taken notice. The confrontation had caught the attention of attorneys, consumer advocates, and even state regulators. What had once been considered a local dispute between a stubborn homeowner and a strict HOA president had evolved into something much larger. A test case for the abuse of power that so many HOA letters were accused of nationwide. David, watching all of this unfold, knew the fight was no longer his alone. For months, he had quietly gathered evidence, piecing together the trail of violations, fines, and intimidation. Now, his files were being reviewed by professionals who understood the legal system, inside and out. What had once been a pile of documents stored in his living room had transformed into the foundation of a case that could topple the HOA's regime. The first cracks appeared in the form of subpoenas. Lawyers representing the Reform Committee filed suit, demanding the HOA release its financial records. For years, Karen had managed the HOA's money with little oversight, funneling funds into projects that seemed to benefit only her allies. Now, those accounts were under scrutiny. Rumors spread quickly. Residents whispered about inflated landscaping contracts, unexplained maintenance fees, and thousands of dollars unaccounted for. Some speculated that Karen had been using HOA funds to bolster her own lifestyle, while others suspected outright fraud. Whether or not the rumors were true, the suspicion alone was enough to erode what little credibility she had left. Karen, however, remained defiant. To her, the subpoenas were nothing more than harassment. She dismissed the lawsuits as baseless and called the Reform Committee a mob of malcontents. Yet behind her bravado, fear had begun to creep in. She knew the financial records would expose things she could not explain away with a clipboard and a glare. Meanwhile, the Reform Committee's petition to remove Karen from office gained momentum. Neighbors who had once been too afraid to sign their names now did so openly. Emboldened by the sight of lawyers and reporters circling the HOA like hawks, the petition reached a critical threshold, forcing a special election to be scheduled. The upcoming vote became the talk of the community. Flyers appeared on doorsteps, meetings were held in garages and living rooms, and candidates began stepping forward to challenge Karen's control. For the first time in years, Brookside Estates was experiencing something it had not seen under Karen's reign: democracy. But Karen was not about to go quietly. She launched her own campaign, painting herself as the victim of a smear plot. She claimed that without her leadership, property values would plummet, crime would rise, and the community would fall into chaos. She even accused the Reform Committee of conspiring with outside activists to destroy the neighborhood. Her speeches grew more desperate, her tone more shrill. As the election drew closer, behind the scenes, however, the legal storm continued to build. The lawyers uncovered questionable liens placed on multiple properties, fines that appeared arbitrary, and instances where the HOA had bypassed due process entirely. More troubling still were discrepancies in the budget, thousands of dollars spent without explanation, and large payments made to companies with vague names and no clear services rendered. As these discoveries surfaced, reporters amplified them. What had started as local news was now being picked up by regional outlets, and even national ones. Headlines described Brookside as a battleground between a tyrannical HOA and a community fighting for its rights. Comment sections filled with stories from people across the country who had faced similar abuses, turning Brookside into a symbol of resistance. Karen hated every moment of it. She couldn't stand seeing her name dragged through the mud, her carefully crafted image as the neighborhood's protector torn apart. But instead of softening her stance, she grew harsher. Security patrols increased, fines multiplied, and board meetings turned into shouting matches. It was as though she believed that if she just held on tighter, everything would return to the way it was before. But the harder she clenched, the more control slipped away. The special election day arrived with tension so thick it hung in the air like a storm cloud. Neighbors who hadn't spoken in years stood in line together, waiting to cast their votes. Some glared at Karen as she passed, clipboard still in hand, her smile tight and forced. Others gave David a nod of quiet respect, recognizing how far his struggle had carried them all. When the ballots were counted, the results were undeniable. Karen's reign was over. The Reform Committee's candidates swept the election, securing a majority on the board. For the first time in nearly a decade, Brookside Estates was free from her grip. But Karen refused to accept defeat. She stormed out of the meeting, vowing legal challenges and threatening to invalidate the vote. Her loyalists clung to her words, but even they looked weary, as though they knew the battle was lost. What Karen didn't yet realize was that losing the election was only the beginning of her troubles. The lawsuits continued, the subpoenas deepened, and the authorities were paying closer attention with every passing day. The Reform Committee, now in power, granted full access to investigators. The HOA's closets were being opened, and the skeletons inside were beginning to rattle. David, though relieved at the victory, knew the fight wasn't truly over. The property the HOA had seized from him still hung in limbo, tied up in legal red tape. The elderly couple's shed still stood as a symbol of the pettiness that had sparked outrage. And Karen, though stripped of her title, still had resources and influence. The legal storm had only just begun to thunder, and its lightning was aimed squarely at her.
Karen had always believed she was untouchable. For years, she had used her clipboard, her title, and her iron will to control Brookside Estates. When residents obeyed her, she felt powerful. When they feared her, she felt invincible. But now, stripped of her presidency, her aura of authority was crumbling, and the weight of her past decisions was bearing down on her like a storm. At first, she tried to cling to denial. She told herself the election had been rigged, that the Reform Committee had manipulated neighbors with lies, that David had poisoned everyone against her. In her mind, she was still the rightful leader of Brookside. But outside of her thoughts, reality was writing a different story. Investigators were combing through years of HOA records, and the findings were grim. Financial mismanagement wasn't just speculation anymore. It was documented fact. Thousands of dollars had been funneled into companies that did not exist, and payments had been made to contractors with suspicious ties to Karen's family. Maintenance budgets had been inflated, while actual repairs went undone. Residents had been forced to pay higher dues, only to watch their community amenities deteriorate. The picture that emerged was not of a strict but principled leaderette, was of a woman who had abused her position for personal gain. News crews descended on Brookside once again, this time not just to cover angry neighbors, but to report on criminal investigations. Karen's face appeared on screens across the region, labeled as a disgraced HOA president. Under investigation for fraud and abuse of power, her former allies scattered. Some resigned from the board quietly, hoping to avoid scrutiny. Others publicly distanced themselves, claiming they had never agreed with her methods. The few who remained loyal were no longer enough to shield her from the growing tidal wave of accountability. Meanwhile, David's persistence was finally being recognized. His files, once dismissed as the rantings of a disgruntled homeowner, were now the backbone of the case against Karen. Each violation notice, each fine, each foreclosure attempt he had documented became evidence of her pattern of misconduct. What she had once used to strip him of his property had now become the very tool that exposed her corruption. The community, too, was changing. Brookside Estates began to heal from years of fear and intimidation. Neighbors who had once avoided each other out of suspicion and fear were now gathering openly, united in relief. Children played in the streets without the shadow of security patrols looming over them. The Reform Committee held meetings where residents could actually voice their concerns without being silenced or threatened. The neighborhood, once suffocated, was finally breathing again. But Karen's downfall was not quiet. She fought every step of the way. When investigators subpoenaed her bank records, she claimed harassment. When residents testified against her, she accused them of betrayal. She even filed lawsuits of her own, desperate to reverse the election and reclaim her throne. But each attempt backfired, draining her resources and reinforcing the narrative that she was unwilling to face the consequences of her actions. The most dramatic moment came when police arrived at her home with a warrant. Cameras caught her standing in her driveway, shouting angrily as officers entered her house to seize documents and electronic devices. The image of Karen, once the queen of Brookside, now being forced to hand over evidence, spread quickly across the news and social media. To many residents, it was the justice they had waited for, a moment of accountability, long overdue. For David, watching the scene unfold brought a mix of emotions. He felt vindicated, yes, but also a deep sense of weariness. The fight had consumed so much of his life, and though Karen's fall was a victory, it could never return what he had lost. His property remained tied up in legal proceedings, its fate uncertain, yet seeing Karen finally face the consequences was enough to remind him that persistence mattered. The legal process moved slowly, as it always did, but the outcome was becoming clearer by the day. Karen was facing not just civil suits, but potential criminal charges: fraud, misappropriation of funds, abuse of authority. The list grew longer with each passing week. Her once proud posture began to bend under the weight of court appearances, mounting debts, and the loss of her reputation. Brookside, however, was moving forward. Under new leadership, the HOA began restoring trust with transparency. Financial records were shared openly with residents. Rules were enforced fairly, without favoritism or vendettas. For the first time in years, homeowners felt like their dues were working for them, not against them. The pool was repaired, the playground cleaned, and community events returned. The very culture Karen had built, a culture of fear and submission, was unraveling. In its place, something stronger was taking root: community. Yet even as Karen faded into infamy, the story of Brookside Estates continued to resonate far beyond its borders. Other neighborhoods saw what had happened and began questioning their own HOA. Stories poured out of similar abuses, similar tyrants, similar struggles. What had started with Karen's greed and David's defiance had become part of a larger movement, shining light on the unchecked power some associations held. For Karen, The transformation of her once loyal kingdom into a community that despised her was the harshest punishment of all. The neighbors who once trembled at her clipboard now crossed the street to avoid her. Children who once feared her glares now whispered and laughed when she walked by. Her reign of control had ended, not with a victory, but with disgrace. And though the legal system would have the final word, in the eyes of Brookside Estates, justice had already been served. The storm that had hovered over Brookside Estates for years finally began to clear. The reign of Karen and her iron grip on the HOA had ended, and in its place was a neighborhood trying to find its footing again. Though the scars of her rule were deep, there was also a sense of renewal, as if the air itself felt lighter without her constant watch. Karen's legal troubles intensified with each passing month. Investigators uncovered evidence that her misuse of HOA funds stretched back years, involving thousands of dollars diverted into shell companies and padded contracts. What had once been dismissed as community gossip became the backbone of a criminal case. She was indicted on multiple charges, and though she fought desperately to paint herself as a victim of conspiracy, the mountain of evidence was undeniable. The trial that followed was slow and grueling. Reporters filled the courtroom, eager to capture every moment of the fallen president's humiliation. Former board members testified, revealing the inner workings of her control, and residents came forward to describe the intimidation they had suffered under her watch. Each account chipped away at the remnants of her power, leaving her exposed and isolated. When the verdict was finally delivered, it was decisive. Karen was found guilty of fraud, abuse of power, and misappropriation of funds. She was sentenced to a significant term of probation, financial restitution, and community service. For some, the punishment seemed too light for the years of damage she had caused. But for the residents of Brookside, it was enough to see her stripped of her illusions of invincibility. The clipboard she had once wielded like a sword was now nothing more than a memory. Meanwhile, the community moved forward. The new board, led by members of the Reform Committee, prioritized rebuilding trust. Transparency became the foundation of their leadership. Budgets were posted openly. Decisions were made in public meetings, and residents were encouraged to voice their concerns without fear. For the first time in years, the HOA served its true purpose, protecting and enhancing the neighborhood, not oppressing it. David's battle came full circle during this time. The property that had been seized from him was finally returned after months of legal proceedings. Walking through the gate of his reclaimed home, he felt both relief and sorrow. Relief that his persistence had paid off, but sorrow for the time and peace he had lost. The house had always been more than walls, and land to him it was a symbol of his independence, his resilience, and his refusal to bow to injustice. Neighbors welcomed him back with quiet gratitude. Many admitted privately that his stand had given them the courage to confront Karen's tyranny. Though David never sought recognition, he became something of a local hero, a reminder that one person's refusal to surrender could spark change for an entire community. As Brookside healed, it also began to thrive. New families moved in, drawn by the promise of a fair and supportive age. Children played freely in the streets, and community events became celebrations rather than tense gatherings under Karen's scrutinizing gaze. The fear that had once suffocated the neighborhood was replaced by laughter, conversation, and pride. The story of Brookside, however, reached far beyond its gates. News outlets continued to share the saga, framing it as a cautionary tale about unchecked power and a victory for ordinary homeowners standing up for their rights. Online forums buzzed with discussions, and other communities began to examine their own HOA practices, inspired by Brookside's transformation. For Karen, the fallout was permanent. Her name became synonymous with abuse of power, and wherever she went, whispers followed. The woman who had once commanded obedience with a clipboard and glare was now remembered only as a cautionary figure, a warning of what happened when greed and pride consumed someone in a position of trust. For David, the journey ended not with triumphal fanfare, but with quiet peace. He tended to his reclaimed property, restored the yard, and raised the flag he had once watched wave, while Karen tried to strip everything from him. That flag, fluttering in the breeze, had become a symbol not just of his perseverance, but of the entire neighborhood's rebirth. Brookside Estates had been tested by corruption, greed, and fear. It had endured intimidation, division, and the theft of its own community spirit. But in the end, the residents had stood together, refused to be silenced, and reclaimed their home. Justice had not come easily, and it had not come quickly. But it had come. And in its wake, Brookside was no longer a neighborhood ruled by fear. It was a community restored, stronger for the struggle, and ready to write a new chapter of its own, one where neighbors trusted one another, where leadership served rather than controlled, and where no clipboard could ever hold power over them again. The HOA had once seized David's property in an act of greed, but in the end, it was that very greed that had backfired, unraveling Karen's empire, and restoring justice not only for David, but for everyone who called Brookside home. And so, with Karen gone, the police and courts having done their part, and the community standing tall, the story of Brookside Estates came to its natural conclusion. A victory not of power, but of persistence, resilience, and unity.